What if I told you that everything you believed about the fall of the great empire is a lie? The true story hides an incredible chain of events that began a full decade before the first alien ships appeared.
For years, the priests observed the signs in the heavens,
reading in the movements of the stars the inexorable approach of the end of their era. The rulers of the capital were not caught off guard. They methodically prepared for massive shifts in the balance of power on the continent. Imagine how difficult it is to make decisions when it seems as though the universe itself is warning you of an impending catastrophe. In today's video, we'll take a detailed look at exactly what predictions the priests saw and why their interpretation led to fatal mistakes in governing the state. We'll reconstruct the chronology of those years step by step.
How secret preparations in the mountains could have changed the outcome of the entire conflict,
had it not been for one small detail. Be sure to watch the video until the end, and you'll learn how a misinterpretation of the night sky led to the most rapid collapse of a great civilization. Like this video right now if you love unraveling the hidden mysteries of the past. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss our next videos. Get comfortable, pour yourself some tea, and let's unravel this incredible story together. Are you ready to learn the truth about how this historical drama actually began? 10 years before the events described, a huge blazing comet streaked across the night sky above the capital. Every night, priests climbed to the tops of the tall pyramids to carefully observe this strange phenomenon. The comet hung over the horizon for weeks, resembling a bright pillar of an unusual and frightening shape. In the closed halls of the palace, the ruler gathered the best astronomers to accurately decipher this heavenly message. No one viewed the comet as an ordinary or random natural phenomenon. Astronomy was the solid foundation of state planning, determining the timing of sowing and the timing of long-distance campaigns. Every slightest deviation in the movement of the stars was viewed as a disruption in the usual order of things. The glowing trail in the sky signaled an impending disturbance of the established and rigid political balance.
The ruler demanded clear answers, but the priests' calculations revealed only growing and inexplicable instability.
Shortly after the comet's appearance, a whole series of total solar eclipses followed. Daylight dimmed, turning the bustling and noisy metropolis into a twilight zone in the middle of a clear day. The city's residents stopped their work, watching with alarm as the sun's disk vanished from the sky. For the state apparatus, this was a clear signal of the impending weakening of the powerful central authority. Messengers were immediately dispatched to all corners of the empire with orders to tighten control over the provinces under their jurisdiction. The ruler of the capital began to radically change his established governance strategy. He significantly increased palace security and restricted access to himself, even for the highest nobility. Advisors who proposed aggressive military campaigns gradually lost their former political influence. They were replaced by those who could interpret ancient texts and predict possible futures. The center of state decision-making gradually shifted from military generals to the priests of the Great Pyramids. During this tense period, another strange and frightening event occurred. The lake surrounding the capital suddenly burst its banks for no apparent natural cause. The water rapidly flooded the lower districts of the city, destroying many houses and stone structures. The best engineers could not logically explain the cause of this localized and destructive flood. The people perceived this phenomenon as yet another compelling confirmation of the imminent collapse of the world as they knew it. Tension in society gradually reached its most critical point. Merchants in the markets whispered about strange people allegedly spotted on the distant eastern outskirts. The ruler's informants regularly reported on growing discontent among the subjugated neighboring peoples. A persistent sense of foreboding hung in the air, an inevitable catastrophe that no one could prevent. The state was slowly but surely sinking into a state of paralyzing and heavy anticipation. All these strange events created the perfect breeding ground for a future strategic collapse. When the foreigners did appear, they were no longer a complete and utter surprise. They became the physical embodiment of all the fears that had been building up in society for a whole decade.
The empire's psychological defenses had been successfully breached long before the first actual physical clash.
Astronomical phenomena accomplished what no enemy army could. This backstory completely changes our understanding of all subsequent historical events. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on this complex and ambiguous issue. What do you think about the influence of astronomy on the political decisions of that time? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to always be the first to access similar historical investigations. Even more exciting and incredible mysteries of the distant past await you ahead. Guess what happened next in this convoluted, intense story? The local calendar was not just a tool for measuring time, but a strict map of inevitable destiny. It consisted of complex temporal cycles that mathematically repeated every 52 years. The year known as one reed fell precisely at the end of one such significant cycle. According to the priest's precise calculations, this year carried the highest probability of radical systemic changes. This specific period was linked to an ancient tale about the return of an exiled leader. The Chronicles claimed that he had gone east, promising to return one day and reclaim his rightful power. The priest meticulously calculated the possible dates of his return, constantly checking the movements of distant stars. The year of one reed coincided perfectly and eerily with the mathematical models of their ancient prophecies. The calendar system itself had trapped the rulers in a cycle of inevitable and agonizing anticipation. At that very moment, the first urgent reports arrived at the palace from the eastern coast. Observers reported with excitement about strange moving mountains on the smooth surface of the Blue Sea.
These enormous objects bore no resemblance to any traditional vessel known to them.
They moved without oars, using huge white sails to catch the sea breeze. The description matched with striking accuracy the metaphors from ancient texts about the ruler's return. This news sent shockwaves through the spacious halls of the capital's stone palace. The mathematical probability of the old prophecy suddenly became an undeniable physical reality. The advisors quickly split into two groups with completely different plans for further action. Some radically proposed immediately stopping the arrivals right on the sandy shore. Others cautiously insisted on negotiations and ascertaining their true strategic intentions. The ruler chose the difficult path of diplomacy and the careful gathering of additional information. He sent distinguished envoys to the coast with lavish gifts and very strict instructions. The envoys were to carefully study the stranger's appearance, their unknown weapons, and their general behavior. Every new metal, every strange fabric on their bodies was meticulously recorded in detailed reports. It was a large-scale intelligence operation disguised as a solemn and peaceful meeting. The gifts sent also had their own deep and hidden psychological meaning. By presenting these valuables, the ruler sought to vividly demonstrate his immense wealth and power. He sincerely hoped that the strangers would be satisfied with the treasures and leave these lands forever. But the effect turned out to be the exact opposite of his original and carefully thought-out plan. The gleam of the yellow metal only further fueled the ambitions of the ambitious explorers who had arrived. Instead of leaving, the foreigners began a slow advance deep into the vast continent. Their confidence and incredible determination frightened the local regional governors. The calendar cycle, which was supposed to bring order, brought with it complete political chaos. The system of government began to crack at the seams under the pressure of new and utterly incomprehensible circumstances. The situation grew more tense with each passing day, bringing the inevitable large-scale clash of civilizations ever closer. The ruler clearly understood that his initial diplomatic plan had failed completely. He urgently needed to find a completely new way to halt this relentless advance. Every decision made only further worsened the strategic position of the besieged capital. Would you like to know exactly how the ancient intelligence system worked, tracking every move of the foreigners? The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the exceptional quality of local intelligence. The capital received the latest intelligence much faster than the contemporary European monarchies. Special stations manned by incredibly resilient runners were stationed along all the main paved roads. This relay system made it possible to transmit important messages over hundreds of kilometers in a single day. The ruler knew of every move the foreigners made long before they actually appeared at the city gates. The scouts did not merely convey words, they created detailed, vivid visual reports. Artists painstakingly drew ships, weapons, and gleaming armor on special long scrolls. These images conveyed the proportions and structure of completely unknown mechanisms with incredible accuracy. Analysts in the capital studied these drawings for hours, trying to find the new enemy's weak points.
Not a single minor detail of the stranger's equipment escaped the watchful eye of the experienced scouts.
In addition to purely military capabilities, intelligence thoroughly analyzed the social structure of this unit. It was noted that all the aliens unquestioningly obeyed a single leader with very strict discipline. They acted with extreme pragmatism, sweeping aside all possible obstacles in their path. Their tactics were completely alien to the local, complex rules of traditional warfare. This was an entirely new type of threat, requiring highly unconventional command decisions. Scouts also reported with alarm on the foreigners' attempts to establish contact with local tribes. The squad leader actively and purposefully sought capable interpreters among the local population. He grasped the complex political situation incredibly quickly and began searching for those dissatisfied with the capital's authority. This was the most alarming information of all that regularly reached the main palace. The enemy was skillfully attempting to destroy the vast empire from within, exploiting old regional grievances. The information delivery system worked flawlessly, but the management analysis itself was seriously flawed. The advisors could not reach a unified and agreed-upon opinion on how to use this data. Fear of an ancient prophecy prevented them from objectively and soberly assessing the enemy's actual numbers. The detachment consisted of only a few hundred men, which was a negligible number for capturing an entire country. Yet they were persistently perceived as the vanguard of a far more powerful and hidden force. With each passing day, the stack of visual reports in the palace grew larger and larger. The ruler spent long hours carefully studying the detailed depictions of these strangers' faces. He constantly sought confirmation of his worst and darkest fears in their unfamiliar features. Information overload led to dangerous indecision at the highest levels of government. The more the capital knew about its enemy, the harder it was to give the final order to attack. This complex situation clearly illustrates the paradox of good intelligence under poor and weak leadership. A perfectly structured data collection system crashed against the leadership's insurmountable psychological barriers. The information was used not at all to prepare for defense, but to gradually intensify panic. The enemy advanced slowly but surely, relying on the capital's strategic inaction.
The fate of the empire was decided precisely during those long days of complete and irreversible informational paralysis.
Intelligence did its job brilliantly, but the rulers simply failed to make proper use of it. This story clearly proves that vast knowledge is worth absolutely nothing without resolve. If you enjoy this kind of in-depth and detailed analysis of historical events, be sure to give it a like. Your support helps us regularly create even more high-quality and interesting content. Stay tuned to dive into the most incredible and intricate mysteries of the distant past. What would happen if no one found out about this fatal strategic miscalculation by the capital? Advancing deep into the vast continent, the detachment of foreigners encountered a powerful independent state. It was a proud tribe that had successfully resisted the expansion of the great empire for decades. Their territory was tightly surrounded by enemies, and their economy suffered greatly from a strict trade blockade. The clash with the newcomers began with heavy, grueling, and extremely brutal battles. The local experienced warriors demonstrated incredible bravery and superb tactical training. They skillfully used the complex mountainous terrain to neutralize the advantage of the enemy's weapons. For several long days, the arriving detachment was on the brink of complete and utter defeat. Food supplies were rapidly running out, and accumulated fatigue was sapping the strength of even the toughest fighters. It was that very critical moment when history could have taken a completely different course. However, the leader of the foreigners demonstrated truly outstanding and unconventional diplomatic skills. In the brief lulls between clashes, he persistently sent messengers with an offer of a favorable peace. He convincingly argued to the tribe's elders that they shared a common and very powerful enemy. His proposal was to immediately join forces for a joint campaign against the hated capital. It was an absolutely brilliant move that forever altered the balance of power across the entire continent. The wise elders accepted this bold proposal after long and very difficult nights of deliberation. They realized that the new unknown weapon could be the key to their own long-awaited freedom. Yesterday's irreconcilable enemies instantly became valuable and incredibly motivated allies. The contingent of foreigners was reinforced by several thousand well-trained and resilient warriors. Now it was no longer just a small expedition, but a real and formidable invasion army. Now the massive allied army was advancing with great confidence toward the continent's capital city. They marched unhindered along the excellent stone roads built by the great empire itself. Small towns surrendered without resistance along the way, having absolutely no desire to enter into conflict. The local population saw this campaign as a real opportunity to free themselves from excessively heavy taxes. The authority of the central government apparatus melted away with every kilometer traveled along this route. The metropolis's defenses proved to be completely and catastrophically unprepared for such a turn of events. All the old military plans were based on repelling attacks by disorganized groups, not a massive army. Experienced generals persistently proposed engaging in a decisive battle on the distant approaches to the city, but the ruler stubbornly continued to believe in the possibility of a peaceful and bloodless resolution to the conflict. His fatal indecision deprived the army of its last chance to deliver an effective preemptive strike. The combined forces finally approached the high mountains surrounding the great and fertile valley. From the mountain passes, a breathtaking view opened up before them of the vast metropolis stretching out in the middle of the lake. It was a sight that struck with its incredible scale and supreme engineering complexity. There was absolutely no turning back for either side of this looming conflict. The most dramatic and complex phase of this massive historical confrontation was beginning. The alliance was firmly sealed, and a massive army stood resolutely at the gates of the capital. The stakes had risen to their absolute peak, and any decision could prove fatal. The empire's ruler's power was rapidly fading, like morning mist over a quiet mountain lake. The city stood frozen in tense anticipation of the inevitable invasion by the new and confident masters of the situation. How did the capital greet its uninvited guests on this fateful and historic day? The entry of the massive united army into the capital took place in absolute silence and without resistance. The ruler made an unprecedented and strange decision to let the enemy into the very heart of his state. It was a hidden gesture of deep despair, disguised as traditional and lavish hospitality. The long-armed column moved very slowly along the wide, smooth stone embankments. Hundreds of thousands of locals watched this incredible procession in silence from rooftops and boats. The metropolis was truly striking, with its architectural splendor and very strict urban order. White stone buildings glistened brightly in the sun, and the markets were full of a multitude of unseen goods. The city was densely crisscrossed by a network of clean canals, along which canoes moved continuously and smoothly. The foreigners were absolutely stunned by the high level of development of this island civilization. They had expected to see simple settlements, but found an extremely complex and well-thought-out urban system. For several long days, the situation remained outwardly stable, yet extremely tense and unpredictable. The ruler regularly and calmly visited the guests, engaging in long and convoluted diplomatic conversations. During one of these routine meetings, the leader of the foreigners committed a completely unthinkable act. He cold-bloodedly ordered his men to place the ruler of the vast city under armed guard. The ruler of a great and formidable empire suddenly became a helpless hostage in his own home. This audacious move completely shattered the familiar and well-established system of state governance. A man who had been considered absolutely untouchable for centuries found himself entirely at the mercy of uninvited strangers. However, he meekly continued to formally rule the empire directly from his new confinement. He issued the orders that were harshly dictated to him by the new and resolute masters of the situation. The local noble elite was in a state of profound shock and utter political disarray. The ruler's capture gave the foreigners unrestricted access to the state treasury. They began methodically and greedily gathering gold from all the temples and palaces of this metropolis. Exquisite ancient jewelry was mercilessly melted down into standard, faceless ingots. Centuries' worth of precious metals vanished rapidly and irrevocably in the hot smelting furnaces. Enormous riches were carefully loaded into hiding places for subsequent shipment across the distant sea. The attitude of ordinary townspeople toward what was happening quickly shifted from astonishment to a deep and gloomy hatred. They saw with their own eyes how their sacred sites were being destroyed and their leader publicly humiliated. The foreigners' local allies behaved very provocatively, stirring up conflicts in the narrow streets. The city's bustling markets rapidly emptied, and the familiar rhythm of life was completely disrupted. A massive, inevitable, and utterly uncontrollable social explosion was brewing in the island capital. The foreign commanders were well aware of the extreme fragility of their current position. A small armed detachment controlled the metropolis solely through the presence of a single hostage. If the angry mob had decided to sacrifice the ruler, the guards would have been crushed in a matter of minutes. They were literally sitting on a powder keg that could detonate from any random spark, and that fateful spark soon ignited due to a tragic and irreparable miscalculation. The trap snapped shut completely on both sides of this strange and unprecedented conflict. The city held the foreigners firmly captive, while they held its chief ruler securely captive. Diplomatic maneuvers had completely run their course, giving way to the expectation of brute force. A severe crisis was looming, one that would forever and radically alter the fate of this continent. Peaceful temporary coexistence turned out to be nothing more than a fleeting illusion before a terrible storm. Are you ready for the shocking truth about exactly how the end of this fragile balance began? The expedition leader was forced to leave the capital on an urgent mission with half of his armed detachment. He had to rush to the coast to resolve sudden political problems. A small and nervous garrison remained in the metropolis under the command of his less experienced deputy. This man lacked any diplomatic flexibility and was prone to panic. At that very moment, the city's main and largest traditional festival of the year began. Thousands of noble residents gathered solemnly in the vast square before the great central temple. They had left all their weapons at home, as strictly required by ancient ritual rules. The festival was accompanied by complex rhythmic dances and the loud traditional music of drums. The remaining garrison commander watched this spectacle with growing paranoid fear. The expedition leader hurried back to the rebellious city in the midst of this utter chaos. He miraculously made his way into the palace, but found himself locked inside with the remnants of the garrison. Attempts to use the ruler as a hostage to calm the angry crowd suffered a crushing failure. When he cautiously stepped out onto the roof, heavy stones were hurled at him by his own people. The authority of the old traditional government was finally, publicly, and irrevocably destroyed. The ruler suffered very severe injuries and soon passed away. His sudden death meant the loss of the very last and most important trump card in the hands of the besieged. Now their fragile lives were protected only by thick stone walls and small remnants of gunpowder. Supplies of food and clean fresh water were rapidly and inexorably running out. The garrison clearly realized that their only remaining goal now was simply to try to survive. Enraged townspeople destroyed the bridges on the dams connecting the island to the mainland. They were determined to starve the enemy to death within the walls of their own refuge. Day and night, the deafening, rhythmic sound of war drums rang out around the besieged palace. This sound drove the exhausted besieged to the brink of madness, completely robbing them of sleep and their last hope. The psychological pressure on the garrison was no less devastating than the constant physical attacks. The strangers undertook desperate and risky sorties, trying to clear a path to safety. They used complex protective mechanisms to shield themselves from stones while building crossings. But every section of the bridge that was painstakingly rebuilt was mercilessly destroyed the very next night. The unit's strength was rapidly dwindling in these endless and utterly exhausting street battles. It became absolutely clear that remaining in the city meant certain and unconditional defeat. The garrison command made the agonizing decision to attempt a breakthrough under the cover of darkness. They quickly prepared portable wooden planks to bridge the gaps in the destroyed dams. The soldiers were strictly ordered to take only the absolute minimum of supplies to maintain mobility. But human greed compelled many to stuff their pockets full of very heavy, glittering gold. This difficult choice between wealth and their own lives proved truly fatal for many. The retreat plan was fully prepared, but the chances of success remained minimal. The city had no intention of letting its defeated enemies go without severe retribution. The night mist reliably concealed the true scale of the catastrophe looming over them. The cold air smelled of rain and the looming absolute strategic collapse. How did this desperate nighttime breakout across the ruined stone bridges go? That night of the breakthrough went down in history as a time of the darkest and most devastating losses. The detachment quietly left the palace and moved silently along the shortest and straightest causeway. Thick, cold fog and light rain reliably concealed their movement during the first few meters of the journey. They successfully installed a portable wooden plank bridge over the first ruined section of the road. The vanguard was able to quickly cross to the other side without raising premature alarm. But this fragile silence could not last long in a city that was already on edge and enraged. The city's vigilant guards spotted the cautious movement on the dam and sounded a loud alarm. Within minutes, the dark surface of the lake was covered with thousands of war canoes and swift skiffs. The metropolis's warriors fiercely attacked the retreating forces on both sides of the narrow, slippery road. The darkness was instantly torn apart by loud shouts, the whistling of arrows, and the roar of gunpowder volleys. The wooden plank was firmly stuck in the mud, and it became completely impossible to move it any further. The column came to an abrupt halt before the next gap, finding itself in a perfect and deadly trap. Panic rapidly swept through the ranks, instantly destroying any semblance of organized military formation. Soldiers, heavily laden with gold, fell into the deep water and sank instantly. The heavy pieces of armor dragged them down, leaving absolutely no chance of rescue. The morning dawn mercilessly illuminated the horrific scene of complete and utter defeat. The expedition leader sat exhausted under a tree on the mainland, staring at the pitiful remnants of his army. More than half of his experienced men had vanished forever on the dark and slippery embankments of the capital. Virtually all the treasure gathered with such incredible effort was lost once and for all. It was the moment of the complete and unconditional collapse of all his most ambitious plans. They were forced to retreat on a grueling forced march toward the lands of their loyal allies. Motivated city militias continued the pursuit, regularly attacking the exhausted soldiers. Without firearms, the remnants of the detachment struggled to defend themselves in fierce close combat. The men subsisted on tough grass and roots, expending their last reserves of strength in the scorching heat. It seemed that the story of this massive expedition would end right here on these dusty plains. The night of catastrophic losses radically altered the balance of power, but did not end the conflict. Both sides had suffered simply monstrous losses and were in desperate need of a prolonged respite. The empire celebrated its temporary victory with great fanfare, actively rebuilding its destroyed bridges. The aliens quietly licked their wounds, methodically planning a new, even larger-scale campaign. The main and decisive battle for the fate of this entire continent was still far ahead. Returning to his trusted allies, the squad leader began the painstaking work of rebuilding their strength. He understood perfectly well that the old tactic of a rapid capture of the capital had completely failed. Now, a very methodical and long-term plan was needed to besiege this vast metropolis. First and foremost, he urgently requested reinforcements from the coast and other controlled islands. He desperately needed new people, weapons, and supplies for the upcoming campaign. At the same time, very active and complex diplomatic efforts were underway in this turbulent region. Paradoxically, yesterday's heavy defeat helped him find new and powerful allies. Many tribes saw with their own eyes that the supposedly invincible capital was, after all, vulnerable and not all-powerful. They began to defect en masse to the side of the new coalition that was forming and gaining strength. The size of the united army grew by the day, reaching truly unprecedented proportions. Meanwhile, the expedition's engineers set about implementing a completely unprecedented project. They boldly decided to build a fleet of small, maneuverable vessels right in the high mountains. The ships were constructed from local varieties of wood using imported rigging. Every single part was carefully numbered for the subsequent complex transport. This new fleet was intended to ensure complete control over the lake during the upcoming siege. Meanwhile, in the empire's capital, significant political shifts were taking place. A new, young, and incredibly determined ruler had been chosen, one ready for a fierce struggle. He fully understood that the enemy would inevitably return and was actively preparing the city for a prolonged defense. Dams were being repaired, canals deepened, and vast new reserves of provisions stockpiled. The metropolis was rapidly transforming into an impregnable water fortress with a very powerful garrison. The new ruler also desperately tried to regain the diplomatic initiative that was slipping away. He loudly promised amnesty to all the rebellious provinces in exchange for their unconditional support. He completely abolished the old taxes in an attempt to unite the nation in the face of a new threat. But trust in the central government had been too severely undermined by the leadership's past mistakes. Most cities chose to adopt a wait-and-see attitude or openly side with the enemy. Preparing for the siege required a truly colossal logistical and organizational effort. Thousands of hardy porters transported disassembled ships over steep mountain passes. The parts were carefully carried by hand across the most difficult terrain for several weeks. It was an incredible feat of engineering, comparable to the construction of the ancient pyramids themselves. A huge and bustling shipyard was set up on the shores of the lake for the final assembly of the fleet. The coalition army began systematically and methodically capturing all the coastal cities. Their main goal was to completely encircle the island capital and cut off its supply routes. Every settlement they captured permanently deprived the metropolis of vital sources of fresh water and food. The tactic of slow suffocation proved far more effective than previous direct assaults. The ring around the vast island city was tightening with relentless and terrifying precision. The assembled maneuverable ships were successfully launched and immediately entered the fray. They were equipped with small cannons that easily smashed traditional canoes. The coalition fleet incredibly quickly gained complete dominance on the surface of this lake. Now the capital was securely blockaded, not only from land, but also from the water. No supply boat could break through this tight cordon anymore. A critical moment had arrived. The massive city was now completely cut off from the outside world. Hundreds of thousands of people were trapped in the metropolis, requiring daily sustenance and care. Supplies began to dwindle at an alarming rate, triggering the first signs of mass starvation. The city's infrastructure, dependent on the delivery of resources, began to suffer critical failures. The siege entered its final and most grueling phase for both sides. Both armies were fully prepared for a decisive clash on the narrow causeways. The city's defenders clearly understood that they had absolutely nowhere to retreat from their island. The attackers knew for certain that a second defeat would be their absolute last. Tension reached its peak, foreshadowing a very long and merciless battle. The strategic pause had finally ended, giving way to a full-scale assault on the fortifications. The most devastating blow to the capital was the deliberate destruction of the water supply system. The massive stone aqueduct that supplied fresh water from the mainland was ruthlessly severed. The metropolis, surrounded by a salt lake, was suddenly deprived of its main source of life. The residents had to desperately extract water from old, long-abandoned wells. The water from them was bitter, brackish, and did nothing to quench their thirst. Supplies of corn and beans in the giant storage facilities were rapidly and inexorably running out. The island's vast population found itself facing a total and merciless food shortage. The markets, once brimming with a multitude of exotic goods, now gaped with utter emptiness. Out of desperation, people began to eat tree bark and the roots of aquatic plants. Hunger became an invisible enemy, undermining the defenses from within more effectively than any cannon. The ruler tried to maintain order in the city through draconian disciplinary measures. The theft of even a small handful of grain was met with immediate and the harshest punishment. He organized the most equitable distribution possible of the remaining food among the defenders of the barricades. But even these extremely strict measures could not stop the looming social catastrophe. Physical exhaustion robbed the soldiers of the strength needed to repel the constant assaults day after day. The coalition skillfully employed the tactic of slow and very methodical advancement. They captured street after street, deliberately demolishing buildings to block the canals. Every destroyed structure permanently deprived the defenders of cover and room to maneuver. The city was literally being wiped off the face of the earth, turning into a flat, stone wasteland. This completely deprived the defenders of the ability to use their usual guerrilla warfare tactics. At night, the tenacious defenders tried to rebuild the destroyed barricades from the rubble. They worked in complete silence, conserving every movement of their weakened bodies. Women and the elderly actively helped the soldiers, carrying stones and passing shells. Despair gave them incredible strength for this senseless but heroic labor. In the morning, they had to start all over again under the enemy's heavy and unceasing fire. The psychological pressure on the exhausted city's residents was utterly unbearable. They saw with their own eyes their sacred temples and centuries-old monuments crumbling. Coalition ships constantly patrolled around the island, a constant reminder of the total blockade. Hope for help from neighboring provinces faded with every new sunset. A great civilization found itself tightly locked in the cage of its own vulnerability. Despite extreme exhaustion, the resistance did not waver for a single day. The townspeople fought desperately for every house, every square, and every staircase. They set up incredibly cunning ambushes in the ruins, inflicting damage on the advancing troops. The expedition leader was struck by the tenacity and fanaticism of the capital's defenders. He offered an honorable surrender several times, but received a categorical and proud refusal. The young ruler personally led fierce counterattacks in the most dangerous sectors. His presence inspired the warriors to incredible feats in hopeless situations. He became a living symbol of his people's unyielding will for independence and freedom. But local heroism could not overcome the overall strategic and logistical failure. The siege ring continued to tighten inexorably around the central square of the metropolis. The territory controlled by the defenders had shrunk to a single small district. Tens of thousands of exhausted people had gathered there, deprived of even the slightest hope of salvation. The streets were densely littered with the rubble of the collapsed architecture of their great past. The silence was broken only by the frequent roar of cannons and the crash of collapsing ceilings. The city was in a state of deep decline, preceding the inevitable end. The final days of this long siege were filled with a grim and heavy anticipation of the end. The defenders understood perfectly well that the next large-scale assault would be decisive for them. Resources were completely exhausted. All that remained was the right to their final battle. The advancing troops were seriously preparing to deliver the final blow to the heart of the empire. A tragedy of continental proportions was approaching its logical and inevitable denouement. The final assault predictably began at dawn, following a heavy artillery barrage. Coalition forces quickly stormed the last fortified area from several directions simultaneously. The weakened defenders were unable to withstand this massive and well-organized onslaught. The barricades finally fell, opening a direct path to the young ruler's last refuge. The resistance broke down in isolated pockets of fighting in the narrow ruined streets. The ruler made a desperate attempt to leave the island in a fast canoe along with his advisors. He planned to make his way to the mainland to organize a new resistance movement. But the coalition's agile fleet tightly controlled every meter of the lake's waters. One of the ships intercepted his boat long before it reached the safety of the shore. The leader of a once great and powerful nation found himself in enemy captivity. News of the ruler's capture spread instantly through the remaining narrow districts of the city. This news crushed the fighting spirit of the last defenders far more quickly than any weapon could. Weapons clattered to the ground, and the months-long, unprecedented siege officially came to an end. A heavy, unnatural, and ominous silence hung over the smoking ruins of the metropolis. The great city, which had once dictated its will to an entire continent, had completely ceased to exist. The consequences of this devastating fall were truly massive and irreversible for everyone. The vast centralized system of governance collapsed, leaving behind a colossal political vacuum. The empire's former allies quickly realized the illusory nature of their newly gained independence. The new rulers began methodically and ruthlessly establishing their own order in the conquered territories. The balance of power shifted forever, ushering in a completely new and complex historical era. The ruined island metropolis never regained its former appearance. Its famous canals were filled in, and new construction began on the foundations of the temples. The stones of the ancient pyramids were actively used to erect the buildings of the new ruling elite. The geography of the vast lake also began to change due to the destruction of the complex system of dams. The material legacy of the civilization was systematically erased from the face of the earth by the new architects. As expected, the victors faced enormous difficulties in governing such vast lands. They had absolutely no knowledge of local traditions or the specifics of agriculture. Attempts to impose foreign methods of governance led to economic crises and local uprisings. The infrastructure built up over centuries fell into disrepair without proper maintenance. A long period of instability and painful social restructuring reigned over the ruins of the empire. The legend of the prophecy that started it all took on a bitterly ironic meaning. The ruler's return from the east did indeed bring an end to the old familiar era. But instead of the expected order and renewal, it brought total destruction and subjugation. The priests who had interpreted the signs of the heavens 10 years earlier turned out to be absolutely right. They foresaw the end, but failed to understand the true nature of the coming threat. The history of this collapse clearly demonstrates the incredible vulnerability of any complex state system. Information overload, belief in old myths, and the indecisiveness of the leadership can destroy an empire. Superiority in intelligence is meaningless if the data is ignored by the ruling elite. And internal political conflicts always play into the hands of an external and motivated enemy. It was a perfect storm of circumstances that led to a catastrophe of colossal continental scale. The long-term effect of this massive event shaped the development of the entire region for centuries to come. The change in power set in motion irreversible processes of merging completely different cultures and technologies. In the place of the old civilization, a new, complex, and contradictory community began to slowly take shape. The fall of the capital was merely the very first step in this long-term transformation. The shadows of the distant past became forever woven into the foundation of the nascent New World. Today, all that remains of its former grandeur are scattered archaeological finds and a few lines in historical chronicles. But the story of its downfall continues to serve as a powerful lesson for future generations. It serves as a stark reminder of how quickly even the sturdiest edifice can crumble. The conflict's escalation ran its full course, from celestial omens to deathly silence. The great drama officially came to an end, leaving behind only the dust of shattered hopes. What do you think of this gripping story about how a misinterpretation of omens led to the collapse of a vast empire? Which part of this complex strategic puzzle struck you as the most incredible? Share your thoughts in the comments below this video, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new in-depth investigations into the mysteries of the past.